Hello students, this is Tahir Siddique. In this video, we will look into the factors that drive price elasticity of demand for products. It means we'll look into the determinants of price elasticity of demand or the factors that influence price elasticity of demand for a product. Okay, let's start. The only prerequisite knowledge in this case is that we need to know what is elastic demand and what is inelastic demand. What is elastic demand? Elastic demand is where demand is more responsive to change in price. It means large percentage change in quantity for a given percentage change in price. For instance, as you can see on your screens that here only 10% demand has decreased by 10% when there is rise in 5% price. So it means demand is more responsive. Demand response is greater in terms of change in price in percentage terms when demand is elastic. Right? On the other hand, when we talk about inelastic demand, where price elastic demand is less than 1, here you can see that a greater proportionate increase in price has caused lesser proportionate change in quantity demanded. So we claim that demand is less responsive to change in price. Right? So what are the factors that will determine that demand for a particular product will be elastic or a particular product will be inelastic? Number one and most important factor is the availability of substitutes. Well, we can say that this is a key determinant of the PED for a good or service. In general, if there are greater number of substitutes available for a product, demand becomes elastic. And if substitutes are lesser in number or no substitutes are available, then demand becomes inelastic. And in some cases, demand can become perfectly inelastic. For example, toothpaste or cold drinks. So demand for a particular cold drink is elastic. So let's suppose if the price of Coca-Cola rises, then its demand may decrease to greater extent because there are many other substitutes available. So some of its consumers may shift to other brands which are relatively cheaper compared to Coke now. The next factor that may influence price elasticity of demand is the proportion of consumers' income that is spent on a product. Means how much or what percentage of total income is spent on a particular good. Goods like salt or ball pen are very cheaper products. Consumers usually spend a very small proportion of their total income on these goods, on these products. For instance, price of salt is 30 rupees. And I assume that a typical consumer's total income is 50,000 rupees. So 30 rupees is very small proportion of 50,000 rupees. Now if the price of salt doubles and new price is 60 rupees, now 60 rupees is still very small proportion of consumer's total income, that is 50,000 rupees. So that rise in price may not influence the consumer to decrease demand. So demand is less elastic or inelastic to change in that price. And in some cases, demand may be perfectly inelastic. The next factor that may influence PED is the time period allowed following a price change, means response time. How much response time is with the consumer? Means when there is price change, can consumer postpone the demand of a product? Means if demand of a product can be postponed, then demand for that particular good may become elastic. But if consumer cannot postpone the purchase of a product, then it means demand is inelastic. In the longer term, consumer gets more time to search for cheaper substitutes so they can switch spending, so demand becomes elastic. But in short term, demand is inelastic because consumer is not having sufficient time to look for cheaper substitutes. The next factor that may influence consumer demand is the degree of necessity. The degree of necessity of a good or service will affect the value of its PED. Products that are usually regarded as essential products, have inelastic demand. Such means products like fuel, medicine, housing, these goods have inelastic demand. When price rises, demand do not respond to that extent. By contrast, the demand for luxury products such as Gucci suits or holidays is elastic, because when price of these products rises, then their demand or their purchase can be postponed. The next factor that may influence price elastic demand is the nature of a product in terms of habits, addiction, fashion, or taste. If products are habit forming, then its speed will be less than 1, means demand will be inelastic. Demand for cigarettes, for example, for smokers is inelastic. When price increases, demand do not respond to that extent. So that is the reason when governments impose taxes on cigarettes, so then that policy to discourage smoking is not that effective, because demand for cigarettes is inelastic. So indirect tax that causes rise in price may add up to government revenue, but may not decrease demand to greater extent. There are people who are loyal to certain sports, so even when price of a ticket goes up, still people will not decrease demand to watch a match in the stadium, cricket match in the stadium. The next factor that may influence price elastic demand is that peak and off-peak demand. Demand is price inelastic at peak times and more elastic at off-peak times. This is the case for transport services. Uber usually engage in surge pricing, that is also known as dynamic pricing. At peak times, demand is inelastic, so peak factor increases. Higher price is charged. The aim of charging high price to the customer is to encourage more drivers to take to the roads to expand supply. So business take advantage of low price elasticity of demand at busy times. Although some economists have criticized this policy because they consider that this is the exploitation of the consumer. But Uber is using this policy, and they claim that through this policy they can fulfill the demand of the customers, because when peak factor is there, then more drivers bring their cars on roads, so consumer demand is fulfilled. So it means, because demand usually in the morning times or pack up time is inelastic, so high prices charged, because it is assumed that demand will be less responsive to that increase in price. So total revenue of Uber will increase. The next factor that may influence price elastic demand is the definition of a good or service, means how a good or service is defined. If a good is broadly defined, then demand for that typical product or that good is inelastic. For example, demand for education is considered inelastic, but demand for education at a particular institute or a particular school is elastic, because there is no substitute for education, but there are substitutes available for education at a certain school. So it depends that how you define a product. Product is narrowly defined or it is broadly defined. So students, these are some of the factors that may influence price elasticity of demand for a product. This is very important topic for your examination point of view. I'm talking about O-levels and A-levels examination. In the next video, I will discuss other demand elasticities, which are income elasticity of demand and cross price elasticity of demand. Until then, goodbye.